Welcome, everybody, to this presentation of our whole community history online, Southern African community history. I can tell you that the person possibly most responsible for whole and everything that we do is Dave Bloom. And the reason is that Dave was my role model in wanting to set up a website commemorating the Kimberley Jewish community where I grew up. And I discovered this amazing Zimbabwe Jewish community, which David made, and got in touch with him. And it's wonderful that since we've become friends and colleagues, and there's so much has happened. So Dave was born and raised in Zimbabwe, where he was head of Habonim during the early 70s, in Rhodesia, of course, made Aliyah in 1973. He served in the IDF's Nachal Brigade. He joined Reuters news agency in Tel Aviv in the late 70s, and in 89 was posted to Zimbabwe as CEO for Reuters East and Southern Africa. He and his family spent 5 years based in Harare and then 3 years at Reuters headquarters in London. Over the years, he's volunteered with various non-profit organizations in Israel, including as chairman of Telfed SA, the Zionist Federation in Israel, currently heads World Machal. After leaving Reuters, he was a partner in a software company in the fintech industry for nearly 25 years. Probably hence he started making his website. He has nearly 3 decades of experience preserving family and community histories. As the founder of the Great Zimbabwe and Zambian Jewish Community website, he's documented Zimbabwe and Zambia's Jewish communities along with an active social media presence and over 100 video clips on a ZJC YouTube channel. He retired 2 years ago, and earlier this year spent 2 weeks in Zimbabwe, including Harare, Bulawayo, and other parts, interviewing and recording the current situation of the Jewish communities. So, Dave, we are flourishing, if I can use a nice word, to hear what you have to say.
Dave Thanks Bloom. Very much. Thanks very much, Geraldine. And I want to pay tribute to your work and all the stuff that you bring us all together on Chol. And you do an amazing job. And I think that, it's a combined effort of many different people like myself who feel it's important to preserve the stories of our communities. I've been involved in preserving the Zimbabwe and Zambian community about 25 years. And I'll be talking about that this evening. I'm going to be doing a 2-part series, really. This is the first part, where I'll be taking you through the history of the communities up until independence. And those were real watersheds for the communities. And then the second part, if I remember, it's on the 14th of July, I believe, Geraldine, is that right? The second part.
Yes, next week.
14th of July. The same time next week, I'll be doing part 2, which is post-independence and much more of an update of what's happening with the communities today. So you'll bear with me, and I'll start off by sharing my screen. And please keep your questions. Write down a note of whatever questions you have, and we'll take questions at the end. And I hope we'll have a nice conversation at the end. So I'm going to share my screen. And if you'll just bear with me for 1 second. Just 1 second. Okay, I'm going to do a slideshow. Can you see my notes, Geraldine?
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I'll start it again. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, now I can't. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Now I can see your browser.
Yeah. Just 1 second.
Okay, we did do
Slideshow.
this in beforehand, and it does work. So
Yeah.
we trust Dave's
Can you see the
IT.
notes now?
Yes.
Okay, stop sharing. And I'll do it again. I'm sorry about that. All right.
All
Okay.
good
And
to go.
you good to go. All right. So thanks again to Geraldine for the invite. I really believe that Hol does important work in organizing and sharing all the work done to digitize the history of smaller communities in Southern Africa. I have given online presentations on the Zimbabwean, Zambian Jewish communities in the past, but this two-part series will give me an opportunity to go a bit deeper. This first part will be about the pioneering days of both countries, as I said, up to their respective independence. And I think one of the central questions really is how did small Jewish communities build such rich lives so far from other Jewish centers? And you'll see from my presentation the extent of that richness. So just to put things into perspective, this is the area we're talking about, was northern and southern Rhodesia. I've got there Nyasaland as well, because I'll talk about the days of the Federation. But just to give you an idea, Zimbabwe covers 150,000 square miles. It's about the same size as Montana in America and about half the size of Texas. Northern Rhodesia is about the same, is slightly larger than Texas. So it's a much bigger area. And it covers nearly 300,000 square miles. It's a very big country as Northern Rhodesia. And I would say that Northern Rhodesia was, in terms of the two communities that I'm talking about, was a much smaller community. And I'll talk about the numbers and the activities of each country. But I also want to just give you a little bit of a historical background as to the southern Rhodesia and what is a very important archaeological find called Great Zimbabwe. And of course, that became the name of independent Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe, for those of you who may not know, may not have ever seen it, I know that there are many people on this call that have probably been there, but just to remind you, it's a really majestic stone city built by the ancestral Shona people between the 11th and 15th centuries. It served as the capital of a very wealthy trading empire that linked southern Africa to international trade routes across the Indian Ocean. The site is famous for its massive mortarless stone walls and represents one of Africa's most significant medieval architectural achievements. It's located in a place today called Mashvingo. It was called Fort Victoria. And you can see from the images that there are significant buildings there, walls, and it covers quite a big area, over 7 square miles. And some of the artifacts that were found there included the Zimbabwe bird, which really became one of the symbols of the independent Zimbabwe. Just an anecdote on that story. When I grew up in Rhodesia, I remember going to the museum at Zimbabwe ruins, and the museum presented a very different story. It presented a story that the Zimbabwe ruins was built by traders coming from East Africa or even the Middle East, and they were the ones who built this whole structure. When I came back in 1989, 1990, we went again to visit the museum. This was now independent Zimbabwe, and the museum had kind of changed the narrative. And they had different archaeologists who were reporting that this indeed was ancestral Shona people who had built the place. So there is a bit of controversy. I don't want to get into the politics of it, but definitely a very significant piece of history for that part of the world. So I'm going to talk about the first Jewish arrivals in that part of the world, who were basically traders and migrants and some professionals. I'm talking about in the early days, there were many traders and adventurers, some refugees, but particularly adventurers. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about some of these characters that came up and some of the first Jewish adventurers who arrived in the area. The area was controlled mainly by a Matabele king called Lobengula. And he started his empire around 1870. He was the son of Mzilikazi, the Zulu king from South Africa. Um, and they were basically a Zulu tribe, the Ndebele's, and quite militaristic, and controlled a really large region using military strength. They did have vast cattle herds and carefully managed the early European traders that arrived there. Who were these early traders? So the first known Jew to arrive in the area is a British-born Jew by the name of Daniel Kish. He arrived in the late 1860s, approximately 1869, to an area that is known as Tati, which is basically an area where there's a river Tati, but it's on the border of what is now Botswana and the future border of what became Rhodesia. He was a prospector. He was in his early 20s, and he arrived many years before Cecil John Rhodes and his basically British South African company got involved with controlling the area. And he became quite a close advisor to King Lobengula. He was very well thought of by Lobengula. Another Jewish character who came a bit later, was a guy called Moss Cohen. His nickname was Paddy Cohen. Apparently he had some Irish background, but he was also from the UK, and also a prospector. And he arrived a bit later in the 1870s, and he secured a verbal promise from Lobengula for prospecting rights in exchange for a horse. That was the deal. Paddy Cohen was quite a character, quite a colorful character. He arrived in Southern Africa as a trader during the early days of British colonization, and he made his way north towards the area of Lobengula, and he became really one of Lobengula's trusted advisors. He never got anything in writing from Lobengula. He did get a trading license. He wrote in his diaries that he got a trading license, and that King Lobengula took a personal liking to him. The license said that he had the license to trade in the territory of Matabeleland. But when Cohen later requested an official written prospecting concession, the king offered him a verbal promise that Cohen would be the first to receive it. However, he didn't put it in writing. This amiable relationship with the king was kind of lost out after really aggressive mining magnates and colonial figures like Cecil Rhodes took over the region. Lobengula's verbal assurances were swept away by the massive kind of geopolitical shift of the British South Africa Company's occupation. Paddy Moss Cohen is buried in the Bulawayo Cemetery. He died and was buried in 1913. This is a picture of his grave. So those were two colorful characters that arrived, really the known Jewish pioneers who arrived in the area, well before Cecil Rhodes. The Jewish migration to the Rhodesias between the 1890s and 1930s was really driven by economic opportunities. along the railroad lines, and basically escaping European persecution. To his credit, Cecil Rhodes had started already building railway lines up to the area of Rhodesia, and even by 1905, the famous Victoria Falls Bridge, was built. So as soon as the railway lines sort of were laid, people followed. I mean, my grandparents arrived in Harare, what is Salisbury, in around 1910, and they came up on the train. The train already reached Salisbury, and they set up their home in Salisbury in 1910. There was a Rhodes connection, the Greek Rhodes Island connection, where Sephardi Jews were fleeing economic decline, and also rising Italian fascism, and they established also a major cultural enclave in Salisbury, even in the 1900s, up to the 1930s. The main influx in the 1920s and 1930s were Lithuanian and Latvian Jews who fled intense anti-Semitism and economic isolation. And of course, again, the railway line enabled them to very easily set up businesses, small businesses. Many of them came penniless, just like the story of the small towns in the rest of South Africa. People were seeking their fortunes further north. They were working as small-scale traders and concession store owners, cattle dealers, and miners. Bulawayo was the primary Jewish capital, where the railway line first kind of reached and became a kind of railway hub. And then the capital of Salisbury was established, and a Sephardic community later became quite a large community, which was quite unique for Southern Africa. You can see the kind of routes that people took when they arrived in South Africa. My grandparents were in Pretoria. They met in Pretoria. My grandmother was originally from Lithuania. She and her family had arrived in Durban in the 1890s, and she and her family made their way to Pretoria. My grandfather made his way from England. He grew up in England. His family originally from Poland, but they were in England from the 1880s. And he, as a young man, sought his fortune in South Africa, also ended up in Pretoria, and that's where my grandparents met. So basically, we're talking about a period when Africa was opening up to colonial powers. But they called it the scramble for Africa. There was really a scramble for all these colonial powers like Britain, Belgium, France, Germany, Portugal, and Spain to grab territories, and there were a lot of prospects for those territories for these people, for those the mother countries, and of course Rhodes was based in Cape Town, had made a fortune as on the mines of Kimberley, the diamond mines, and there's this famous cartoon you can see on the left-hand side, of him straddling the whole of Africa with his vision of he had this Cape to Cairo kind of project of putting a railway all the way from Cape Town to Cairo. Partially achieved, I would say he got about halfway, probably to Tanganyika is probably the furthest north, or maybe even Kenya, the railway line reached. But that was the dynamics at the time. The colonial powers were looking to control the very rich, both agricultural and mineral deposits in Africa. And of course, now we also have this Jewish connection with Cecil Rhodes of two of his most important partners. Alfred Beit was a financial genius and a strategist, and he was from a German financial banking family, and he helped to secure massive capital and foreign investment needed to fund Rhodes' empire. Another colorful character was Barney Bonato, who was a British-born street smart Kimberley pioneer. There's a connection there, Geraldine, who built really a huge diamond empire before he bought into De Beers and became a partner and a life governor of that company. And those three gentlemen were very much involved in financing the early settlements in Rhodesia. There was this thinking that, if there were huge deposits in Kimberley and on the Rand where gold was found around Johannesburg, there must be further deposits further north. And and of course, it also linked up with Rhodes's belief that he was representing the Queen in expanding Rhodesia, the British Empire in Africa. So that's those two combinations, both a political ambition and a commercial ambition. So why and when did they come, and what were their main activities? I mentioned the Pioneer Column, which is sponsored by Rhodes, arrived in the area of what became Salisbury in 1890. It was a volunteer force financed by the British South Africa Company that basically Cecil Rhodes owned. And their job was to annex Mashonaland, despite the fact that he had made a deal with Lobengula with the Rudd concession in 1888. He basically didn't really take it very seriously and sent up a column of about 400 people. They arrived in 1890 to set up what was called Fort Salisbury. There were two Jews in that column, that pioneer column. One was Trooper Mosenthal, who served as a trooper within the military and paramilitary elements. And the Mosenthals were a prominent German Jewish family, heavily involved in early South African trade and finance. And members of that family migrated north with the early colonial expansions. The second Jew in the column was Conductor Solomon, who served as a transport conductor responsible for managing the heavy ox wagons and logistical supplies that were crucial to cutting through the African terrain. So those are really some of the first Jews who were there under the auspices of the British South Africa Company. And very soon, Jewish communities started to develop, and Jews were involved in community affairs in very early days. We have Isaac Hirschler here and Joe van Praag, who served as mayors. Hirschler of Bulawayo and Van Praag of Salisbury, and Michael Walensky, who became the mayor of Gatuma, and his son later became Soroy Walensky, and I'll talk about him a little later. There were other mayors, Jewish mayors. These names include Harry Pachanik, Ivor Pitch, Bernard Ponter, and R.S. Cowan. They served over very many years or various periods in Harare. In Bulawayo, there was also a lot of Jewish people involved in municipal affairs, local government. And I. Hirschler, he was Bulawayo's inaugural mayor. He was a Jew and made history by becoming the first mayor of Bulawayo, serving between 1897 and 1898. Others the other Jewish mayors included E. Bush, H. Ellenbogen, C.M. Harris, Ayman Ashi, and Ulrich Goldwasser, who was elected in 1968. So Jews were very much involved already in the running of these towns in just southern Rhodesia, and very much involved in the communities. And they were starting to build Jewish life, synagogues, cemeteries, welfare and societies, schools and clubs. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the next few slides. But Jewish life was certainly developing in the early 1900s. The first synagogue was built in Bulawayo in 1894. It was actually you can see not a very good picture here of the laying of the foundations of the Bulawayo synagogue. Previously, it had been a tent. It was officially inaugurated in 1894. The first services were held with 21 Jewish pioneers in August 12, 1894. In 1899, there was the first permanent building in Bulawayo. And the first brick synagogue was completed in 1911. And then a grander, more permanent synagogue featuring a Cape Dutch facade was consecrated in 1911 at the corner of 3rd Avenue and Jason Moyer Street. In Harare and Salisbury, there was a similar process that started in 1895, and by 1910, if I remember, the main shul was built in Harare. So this is a bit of the history of this is just a bit of some of the buildings that were the first buildings that were put up. A Jewish school was put up in Bulawayo, and you can see the main by 1920 the Salisbury Street Synagogue was built, and but between 1910 and 1920, the Jewish population of Rhodesia was around 1,500 Jews. In northern Rhodesia, there were between 50 and 100 Jews during that period. Okay, so those are just examples of how they started to develop their institutions. Of course, the two main centers were Harare and Bulawayo. At the time, Salisbury and Bulawayo. But smaller communities had also developed. Again, along the railway line between Bulawayo and Harare and Salisbury, there were towns like Gwelo, Kwekwe and Gatuma. And to the east of Harare, east of Salisbury, the town of Umtali on the Eastern Highlands, where the train had a route to the port of Beira in Mozambique. And all these train routes helped to really open up the country. There were much smaller areas where Jews were located in Yazura, in Wangi, Penalonga, Wanda, and Shabani. There weren't really Jewish communities. There were Jewish families living in those small, mainly farming communities. And I'll talk a bit about that a little later, and certainly in the second part of my presentation. So the makeup of the Jewish communities was, I would say, mainly Ashkenazi, either South African or from British roots or Eastern European roots. But I mentioned, of course, the Sephardic community, which was quite unique and developed in Harare from the 1920s, 1930s. And you can see here, these are more recent pictures of the Sephardic Hebrew congregation shul and the hall in Harare. The Sephardic Jewish community was founded primarily by Ladino-speaking immigrants, and they developed a really thriving cultural and economic hub in Zimbabwe. The first arrivals were in about 1895, followed by a large influx fleeing Italian fascism. By 1931, They had established a congregation, and really the golden era was the 1950s and 60s when they built the Sharei Shalom synagogue and expanded it also with refugees who had fled from the Belgian Congo. You can see pictures of the beautiful shul on the slide in front of you. They were very involved also in helping to develop the Rhodesian economy. Names like Sam Levy, who was a property developer, and Victor Cohen, who had an extensive textile business. They were very successful in a number of different businesses. The Aladefs also in their business in Harare. Other earlier, people, Jews were involved in earlier establishments of hotels. You can see here in 1905, one of the first hotels in Salisbury, which was owned by Jacob Goldberg. Jews were very active in contributing to civic life, to commerce, to medicine, the whole range of professions in Rhodesia, and in northern Rhodesia. I'm talking about northern and southern Rhodesia. And I'll give you a few examples. Talk a bit about the Goldberg family, who were really Zimbabwe's tobacco pioneers. They were prominent Jewish pioneers in the Otsi area, which is the region of Manicaland in the eastern area of Rhodesia. They were a real global tobacco empire. They built Lee Ranch into the world's largest single tobacco producing unit. They were a real economic hub. They had other activities, a trading network, and I believe a local hotel. And they spearheaded regional advocacy for localized agricultural research in the 1940s. They were quite a large family, 7 siblings, and one of them I'll talk about, Benny Goldberg. I'll talk about him. He got involved in politics. Mick was probably the leading sibling in terms of the agricultural side, but and his sisters were involved in nursing, and they really were incredible family in terms of how they contributed to both local culture, local communities, and for the betterment of the whole country. I'm going to talk about now Dr. Michael Gelfand, who was he was a prominent physician and historian who specialized in tropical medicine, particularly documenting the Shona people. He was awarded the papal knighthood of the Order of St. Sylvester for his dedicated medical work in rural mission stations. In 1962, he joined the University College of Rhodesia and Nyasaland in Harare and as founding professor of African medicine. From 1970 until his retirement in 1977, he was professor and head of the Department of Medicine, and thereafter emeritus professor and senior clinical research fellow. An amazing man, wrote many books on the whole study of African medicine. Really a world leader. He was one of the few Jewish, I would say, members of the Jewish community who had a sort of almost like a state funeral when he died. At the time, the president, Robert Mugabe, attended his funeral. It was a very significant affair with a lot of respect given to this man. In Bulawayo, in terms of cultural activities, they had a Jewish theater in the Yiddish theater in the 1940s. There were amateur productions, concerts, and Yiddish plays. indicating that a lot of the people who were in Bulawayo originated from, Eastern Europe, but Germany and certainly probably, countries that where Yiddish was a dominant language. And these performances provided a vital social outlet for the immigrants. There was the Jewish Guild Hall in Bulawayo that was part of the synagogue complex, and it featured a hall where all of these plays and wedding receptions were held, and the first classrooms were housed. I want to talk a bit about Zionism and Israel regarding the Rhodesian communities. There was fundraising. There's a picture here of quite a unique picture of Chaim Weizmann, who visited Bulawayo and then the Victoria Falls in about 1938, and he was raising money to help build the first sort of towns and villages in what was then Palestine. But Zionism certainly was a very strong feature of the Jewish communities throughout the Rhodesias. There was an organization called CASA, the Central African Zionist Organization, that was set up to kind of organize all the different activities of WITSO, the Jewish youth movements, and you can see here in this next slide examples of Zionist conferences, a picture of a large number of Habonim youth movement members, Zionist Youth Council members. You can see a picture here of the Wingate Jewish Sports Club in Harare. And so Jewish institutions were developing during the 50s and 60s. And of course, there were other youth movements. There was Beitar, there was Bnei Akiva. And but the communities were very, very organized. I mean, I grew up in, really, I describe it as living in a bubble within a bubble. My bubble was the Jewish community of Salisbury within a larger white bubble in Rhodesia. And that, of course, was in a larger bubble of the greater Rhodesia with the black population. But a very cohesive and very organized community. By the 1950s, there was a movement to set up. There was a lot of pressure from the British, who was still basically the Northern Rhodesia was still a protectorate, and it still had some sway over Southern Rhodesia. But there was a lot of pressure to liberalize the affairs of the blacks and to give them more freedom. And an experiment really was established in 1953, called the Federation of Northern and Southern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. This was the federal government sat in Harare in Salisbury, and the prime minister of the federal government was Sir Roy Welensky. I mentioned his father earlier, and I'll talk about Roy Welensky shortly. That lasted 10 years, but it was a period of privilege and of, I would say, of prosperity. The countries did grow well during that period, but politically it was not sustainable. The federation, as I said, was run by Prime Minister Sir Roy Welensky, whose father was Jewish and who identified as a Jew, but his mother was an Afrikaner who had actually converted. And in that federal government was Benny Goldberg. I mentioned the Goldberg family earlier. Benny Goldberg was a federal minister of health, very much involved in setting up the university, the medical faculty of the University of Rhodesia. And in Bulawayo, Abe Abramson was actually the Minister of Labour and Housing under Edgar Whitehead. There was basically a government for Southern Rhodesia under the federal government run by Edgar Whitehead, and Abe Abramson was a member of that government. And all three of them, the common denominator for all three of them, excuse me, was that they were advocates for partnership. Their idea was of a gradual racial integration, and that was basically before a more conservative white nationalism took over, certainly in Southern Rhodesia. These are other examples of businesses that were prospering in Harare. The Alida family, the Ruda family. There were many, many other businesses run by Jews, very successful businesses, which I will not list. I have all those details on my website. But the community was doing well during those years. But the federal, there was a lot of uncertainty. By 63, the federation had collapsed, and I'll talk a bit about that shortly. Other leaders in the community, which I want to mention in Southern Rhodesia, there's Bill Margolis, Justice Golden, who was a judge of the High Court, and Bill Margolis, William Margolis, who was an agricultural economist. He helped to transfer the economy from Southern Rhodesia. He was awarded the MBE, and he chaired some of Rhodesia's most successful agricultural marketing bodies, including the Grain Marketing, Agricultural Marketing Authority. Was very involved in the Jewish community, and certainly the Margolis family were very involved in many different projects of the Jewish community. I'll just briefly talk about the Midlands in Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia. I mentioned them earlier. This is a picture of the Gatuma synagogue, which was built in 1953. And there were probably between 80 and 100 Jews in Gatuma at that time. There was a community in Kwekwe, a small community, and in Gwelo as well. Other names to mention during that period, in Gatuma, Robert Sternberg became the town's first Jewish mayor in 1956. In Kwekwe, Soli Aronovitz was mayor during the 1950s. And Morris Hirsch was elected mayor in Kwekwe before becoming a member of parliament. In Gwelo, Morris Jacobson served 2 consecutive terms as mayor in the 1940s. The Bulawayo Hebrew congregation was a thriving community, built incredible institutions. The Bulawayo synagogue was a magnificent synagogue. They had also the Park View Weitzman Sports Club. And I just want to mention on the back of that, I mentioned Wingate earlier. There was a limited amount, I would say, of anti-Semitism in the country. The government had imposed some quotas of Jews arriving in the 1940s in Rhodesia. Interestingly, I'll talk shortly about what happened in Northern Rhodesia, but Jews were not welcome in certain clubs, and sport was certainly a very big part of the culture. Jews were not welcome in certain clubs, and so they basically set up their own clubs certainly in Bulawayo and in Harare. So as I mentioned, by 1963, the federation had collapsed, basically due to really an unsustainable white minority rule. There was intense African nationalist resistance. And there was rapid decolonization. The famous Winds of Change speech in 1960 had meant that Britain wanted to rid itself of its colonies, and Northern Rhodesia actually transitioned quite smoothly to independence in 1964 to become Zambia. Nyasaland also gained independence in 1964 to become Malawi. But Southern Rhodesia, sort of the, um, the momentum for Britain, and Ian Smith declared UDI from Britain and declared Rhodesia a white minority country, and decided to try and fight it out. UN economic sanctions were imposed on Rhodesia, which really were quite significant on the economy. And then, of course, in the early 1970s, there really was the beginning of a really brutal and bloody bush war, which lasted till the end of '89. I'll talk a bit about that later, but basically Rhodesia was very isolated economically. Ironically, it actually boosted the local economy because the Rhodesians were very creative and were building local industries. And for a while, there was actually a boom in Rhodesia, despite the limitations of some oil restrictions and other restrictions. The country actually, I would say, in the long run, actually did quite well economically. I won't talk about the military effect, of course, of the armed struggle of the liberation struggle that the blacks were waging, which really caused tremendous amount of harm and a lot of blood was spilled during that period. And post federation, by the mid '60s, there were about 7,500 Jews in Rhodesia. But many whites and Jews had left Zambia in the mid '60s. I guess basically they voted with their feet. They did not really believe in a future black majority rule of Zambia. And I mentioned the Bush War. The insurgency in Rhodesia was growing, and the pressure on Rhodesia was quite significant. Having said that, in Harare, for example, the Harare Hebrew congregation decided to build a new synagogue in the complex that they had bought in the early 1970s, and they finished building in 1977, which was really, I guess, in the middle of that Bush War era, and in fact was the beginning of the decline. It was amazing that the community had started to decline in the early '70s because of the war, because of the economic and security uncertainty. But these, you can see the images of the two sections of the Jewish community in Harare. What was the Harry Margolis Hall is no longer that name, and the beautiful and modern Ashkenazi synagogue on the right-hand side. Other institutions in Zimbabwe and Rhodesia at the time, the beautiful Savion Lodge in the old age home built in Bulawayo. There were various magazines and newspapers. The Kaza magazine was published from 1958 to 1970. Prior to that, there were magazines like the Jewish Guild. Of course, the Chevra Kadisha were active and there were very well managed cemeteries in all the communities. And I'll also talk a bit more about that later. Schools had been built in the 1960s. In Harare, the Sharon School was built. At its peak, I guess in the mid or early, maybe late 60s, it had about 150 Jewish pupils. It was the first private school in Rhodesia to actually admit black pupils. In Bulawayo, in 1958, the Carmel School had been established, and at their peak, they had 158 Jewish students. And so you can see that the communities were very well organized in many different ways in the institutions that they had created. In northern Rhodesia, the community started basically in Livingston and then spread to Lusaka and the small towns of Ndola and Kitwe and the Copper Belt. And I guess the main trigger for the expansion in northern Rhodesia was the opening of the Victoria Falls Bridge and the railways in 1905. But there were smaller communities in Broken Hill, in Kitwe, in Mufulira, and in Luancha. Much smaller communities, but also very, also I'll talk about their achievements. Basically, the Jewish immigrants of northern Rhodesia faced their journey from being penniless refugees from Europe, being prominent architects of the nation's development. They arrived at the turn of the 20th century, and these settlers established vital trading empires, starting in Livingston and then later in Lusaka. There was also some political activism in the form of Simon Zukas, who championed the independence movement and served in the national government later. The legacy of this community is also cemented through significant philanthropy, including the funding of the Copperbelt University School of Medicine, using proceeds from the sale of synagogues. And also, ultimately, the sources illustrate a profound relationship where displaced population found haven in Africa and in turn dedicated their lives to the economic advancement in their new home. Some key individuals from the Northern Rhodesia communities, Harry Wilson and Harry Sussman, were prominent Jewish immigrants. So Harry Sussman had arrived in about 1901. He was the older of the two, but then he was joined by Harry Wilson. He was joined by Harry Wilson, who arrived in 1929 at around the age of 18 with about 10 pounds in his pocket. These two formed an amazing partnership, which went on to create a credible business in Southern Africa with about 150 retail stores, 220,000 hectares of farmland, and Eli Sussman, Harry's brother, and Harry also were hugely successful in establishing the Woolworths retail chain in South Africa in partnership with Max Sonnenberg. These were really serious business people who had really started from nothing. The town of Livingston was established in 1905. Became home to the first Jewish community in Northern Rhodesia. Most of the years that followed the First World War, the majority of the stores were owned or run by Jewish traders. By 1913, there were about 10 Jewish families in Livingston. The Sussmans and the Grills, whose families had known each other in Lithuania, they formed the nucleus of Livingston's Jewish community. A significant factor in Livingston community growth was the arrival of Marcus and Fager Grill and their 10 children in 1909. The peak of white population of Northern Rhodesia was about 74,000 in about 1961. Just to give you an idea, in Southern Rhodesia, The peak of white population was about 250,000. White residents made up about 2.3% of the population, and the Jewish community represented about 1.6% of the white community. At its peak, the Jewish community in northern Rhodesia was around 12 to 1,500 people. Just briefly I mentioned briefly about the question of quotas. There's a very interesting book by a guy called Frank Shapiro, who wrote a book called Haven in Africa. He asked and he investigated some interesting questions about the fact that there was no quota for Jews in northern Rhodesia. One of the few territories in the world that actually had no quotas for Jewish immigrants. And he asked a lot of questions about why Jews in Europe did not know this. Why did they not hear about this? I'm not going to go into the whole thesis, but it's if you're interested, it's quite a book that I think should be read to understand the dynamics of both the local Jewish community within the white British colonial power and some of the dynamics there. Okay, moving on. Zambian synagogues were built in Lusaka, in Livingston, and in Ndola. These were sold. None of them are active today, but they were all sold. Luanshya had a synagogue. Mufulira had a synagogue. Small synagogues, but were later sold, and none are in use today. Some key individuals from northern Rhodesia. You know, Stanley Fisher was born in Mazabuka in northern Rhodesia. He then moved to Bulawayo to do his high school studies at Milton High School in Bulawayo. He was an active member of Habonim and spent time in Israel after high school, where he first learned Hebrew. Fisher served as the 8th governor of the Bank of Israel, and from 2005 to 2013, and he also was a deputy chair of the Federal Reserve Bank in America. I mentioned Simon Zukas, but he was widely known for his role in Zambia's struggle for independence and for his later contribution to the return of multi-party democracy. Zukas and his family had arrived from pre-war Lithuania, and as I said, he became deeply involved in the nationalist movement. And he also served as chairman of the Council of Zambian Jewry. Other key individuals in the Zambian community, Abe and Michael Galoon, Abe the father and Michael the son, prominent Jewish Zambian entrepreneurs, community leaders, also arrived from Lithuania. Abe built a massive agricultural and dairy empire, winning the title, the man who feeds the nation, from President Kaunda. Michael later took over for the family businesses and succeeded his father as chairman of the Council of Zambian Jewry. I'm getting towards the end now, and then I'll take questions. I'm going to mention my website and where I've been collecting stories and records of the Zimbabwe and Zambian Jewish communities. You can find it at www.zjc.org.il, and I have a very active Facebook group with well over 3,000 members, sharing nostalgia and current news from our widely spread current and former community members. I also have an active YouTube channel with over 100 video clips with interviews of a number of members, of former members and current members of the ZJC. So to wrap up, I'm wrapping up at a point where both countries, well, Zambia, Northern Rhodesia, as I said, got independence in 1964, but Zimbabwe got black rule in 1980. African nationalism and the Rhodesian Bush War was just too, the whites just could not sustain minority rule, and eventually capitulated. Ian Smith eventually signed agreements to hand over power to the blacks of under Mugabe. And in part 2 of my presentation next week, I'm going to talk about post-independence and what happened to the Jewish communities and where they are today. Because I was there in January, and I think I managed to collect a pretty good idea of where things are today, and I'd like to share that with you. So with that, I'm going to end and hand back to Geraldine and ask for any questions.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's been a real tour de force, and we've got a very good picture of how things developed and went on. Anybody want to comment or offer any, ask any questions, or Dave, you can stop the share now if you like, and then we can
see sorry.
Everybody. There we are. Do raise a hand either physically or otherwise. I can say that on the whole website, under communities, you can find the Zimbabwe Jewish community. Also, on the memoirs pages, there is a monograph about Alfred Beit. And Alfred Beit was certainly a very influential person in Rhodesia, having made his money with Rhodes in Kimberley. He absolutely idolized Rhodes. He was a very shy German from a Jewish family who had been assaying minerals for many years. And he was quite a genius, but he carried on. Rhodes only got halfway because he died very early. It was before he was 50. He said so much to do. And Beit was the one who carried on creating the infrastructure, building bridges, roads, telegraphs, and connecting the area, which Rhodes wanted. He just wanted to fulfill Rhodes's dreams. So actually, it's interesting if you want to read there are 2 parts. One is the Kimberley part, and one is the thing, and it's under memoirs on the whole website. And of course, you all know the whole website is www.whole.website. So it's very easy to find. Larry, is that no? Who would like to say something to Dave? Are there any people here from Simonburg? Do unmute yourself, please. And you have to unmute yourself in order to be heard. You know how to do that, I hope. There's a little, at the bottom left, there's a little microphone audio thing. You have to click that so that the red...
Okay.
Yeah.
Done. Right. Yeah. I'm originally from Cape Town, now retired, living in Israel, Hadera. My question is, and comment is, firstly, I feel that I missed out in life by not having been born in Rhodesia at the time. It sounds to me as a wonderful place to having grown up, especially in that not only Jewish environment, but that South African or African bushveld environment. My question relates, is an economic one. I've always had the impression, contrary to the early development of the Jewish community in Cape Town, where I'm from, is that there was not much in the way of poverty among the Jews. I'm not speaking of the very early pioneering years, but let's speak of the 50s and 60s. What was the economic standing of the community at large?
It's one of those hard things to generalize, but certainly I can tell you that the generation of my grandparents who arrived, they arrived with nothing. They really, and I would compare them to the the smaller towns in South Africa where Jews arrived, and I'm thinking of I don't know, Geraldine knows a lot of these smaller places in South Africa. I'm not aware, but by the second generation, my parents, my dad, certainly the generation of the post-war generation, I would say, Second World War, really were much more established. To say there was poverty, I'm not aware of outright poverty. There were certainly Jews. There was a range of I would say, of standards of living, but not desperate poverty. I mean, there was certainly a lot of opportunity, certainly as a white person, and because the Jews were also very cohesive and helped each other in establishing businesses. I mentioned the Sonnenbergs and the Wolfsons. We also started from nothing, but they provided loans to each other and helped establish businesses. I'm maybe someone else in the group will have something other perspective, but from my understanding, the standard of living was generally quite high. Given that the standard of living of the whites of Rhodesia was high, the Jews, I would say, were on higher up on the ladder.
Thanks, Dave. Bonnie, would you like to, I don't know if you can share your picture and speak at the same time.
I don't multitask well. So I thought I would just ask my question,
Sure.
which was basically just to ask that Dave didn't mention anything really about the immigration or the settlement of Holocaust survivors after the war. My father was one, and my parents in Rhodesia, my parents, all of their friends were Holocaust survivors. Was there a significant settlement of Holocaust survivors in the 1950s, late 1940s and 1950s?
So again, Bonnie, I would say from what my understanding is that if there were mainly Bulawayo, and that I think I touched on that with the Yiddish theater that had developed in Bulawayo. I think that became a sort of a focus of perhaps some of the those immigrants who came in the 40s. In Harare and Salisbury, there were families, of course. There were some families who survived the Holocaust and were originally from Rhodes Island, and members of the Sephardi community. I remember seeing a few people in Harare who still had numbers on their arms, who had survived Auschwitz. Not many, but they did come, and they did join their families in Harare. I can tell you that one thing that always struck me about growing up in Harare, in Salisbury, was that we did not really, I don't remember much of an acknowledgement of the Holocaust. There wasn't that we used to have, we'd celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, and we'd celebrate Israel-related things, of course, all the Chagim, but I don't remember specifically anything sort of commemorating the Holocaust. And I would have thought that if there were a number of people, that they'd want to do that or to have that that commemoration. Perhaps other people in the group can share their thoughts on that. But my personal experience was that there was not much awareness. I, for example, did not know until much later of the whole tragedy of the Rhodes community. Something like 1,200 Jews from Rhodes, who was basically caught up in the war, were shipped to basically to Auschwitz, and I think only a couple of hundred survived. So the Rhodes community was really decimated, and those who managed to get out got out either before the war or, as I said, survived and arrived after. Excuse me.
Thank you, Bonnie. So, Dave, we look forward to meeting again next week. Perhaps we can save up our questions. Something that always concerned me was this: in the very early days, after the Pioneer Corps went up, after Rhodes basically smashed the Matabele and took all their cattle as war booty, many Jews seemed to go to Rhodesias as cattle speculators. And it struck me that what they were doing were helping Rhodes redistribute the cattle from the Matabele and giving them to the whites that he'd promised farms to. Have you any comments on that?
Again, I've not heard of that particular angle of them basically taking over cattle. I know that for example, I mentioned the Sussmans and the Wolfsons in northern Rhodesia were huge cattle breeders, but they also suffered enormous loss of cattle from rinderpest, from various cattle, foot and mouth disease. It wasn't plain sailing for the cattle breeders, and there may have been some cases of them stealing, taking over from the Matabele, but I mean, there's one story of a guy, Harry Sher in Bulawayo, very colorful individual. I'd love to tell you this quickly. He was a beneficiary of the cattle trade because he developed a very large business of hides. He used to produce hides or process hides and developed a business which exported to Europe, and really a very, very wealthy individual. He never married. And he was a bit of I would say, a bit of what's the word in Yiddish? What's the word? When you're not very well dressed. Schlump. Yeah, he was a bit of a schlump. And he was not a very, I would say, perhaps not a very cultured person, but he was a very kind person. But he used to go to this hotel in Bulawayo to get to sometimes have his meals. And the legend is that he arrived in this hotel. It was quite a fancy hotel in Bulawayo at the time, looking a bit schlumpy, and arrived and ordered his meal. And again, maybe his eating habits were not quite the standard of the British colonial style. And apparently the manager of the hotel did not know him, sort of confronted him and actually suggested that maybe he leave the premises because he wasn't dressed properly, or he wasn't behaving properly. The story is, again, the legend is that Harry Sher promptly left the hotel, promptly instructed his accountant to buy the hotel, and he fired the manager.
Yeah.
I mean, there were all these kind of stories of quite colorful characters that lived in those parts of the world. But I can tell you that there were, I've spoken to Simon Goldberg. I hope Simon is still on the call. Simon lives in Penalonga. He still lives in Penalonga. I hope you're there still, Simon. And he told me a lot of stories about, and I've read a lot about his family, how his grandparents first arrived in that part of the world. And they literally lived in mud huts, and they lived in really poor conditions, and they really built themselves up from nothing. And the Goldbergs then went on to become, by second generation, very, very successful farmers and industrialists and politicians, and hugely contributed to the economy of Rhodesia.
Yeah, I think you expressed it so well, and you said, and it's the same in South Africa, that we grew up in a bubble within a bubble.
Right.
At the most wonderful time. We were extraordinarily privileged. And Larry Averman, will you unmute to say something? Unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself, otherwise we can't hear you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that my grandparents came from Romania. It was a bit different from, I think the majority of Jews came from Lithuania, etc. Um, we were related to one of the Solomon brothers, who was a kind of pioneer. He went out first, and then he told the family about how good it was, etc. And then they came. But they moved around a lot. They were in Shabani, in Livingston, Lusaka, and Bulawayo. And I'm not really sure about when and how long they were in each place. I've got some photographs, but it's very difficult to date them. So if anybody's got any information about that, I'd really appreciate it. Um, yeah, the other thing is that uh, they actually went back on a family visit to Romania, and then World War One broke out, so they got stuck there for a couple of years. So that was a really difficult time for them, the early years. But they made it through. And then the other thing I just want to mention is that um, I think some of the Jews from Rhodes went to the Congo, and when things started falling apart, then some came to Rhodesia, as it was then, and also to Cape Town.
What? Oh, I should go. I'm going to zoom. Who's that?
Anyway, that's about all I have to say.
It's very interesting. When I was at university in 1957 to 60, there were some girls there from the Copper Belt. They seem to be from European families, from Germany, who were from Mufalira and Ndola, and very sort of cultured families who sent their children to Wits from the Copper Belt. Well, thank you, Dave, so much again. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Barry, did you want to just say goodbye, or do you want to speak? If you want to speak, you have to unmute yourself. Because we can't hear. Yeah.
I've just transitioned from my tablet which I couldn't work it on, so thankfully I'm at my PC. My family emigrated from the UK to Bulawayo, and I'm trying to figure out which of the years from 1895 to 1897 that they went, because I have conflicting reasons to believe both 1895 and 1897. I know this isn't a genealogy site, it's more a history site, but I'm interested in the history also, of course, of that era. I have two questions. One is, and maybe I missed this, was it usual or uncommon to go directly from the UK, obviously via South Africa, to Bulawayo, as opposed to being settled a little bit in South Africa and then going to Bulawayo? My second question is if David knows, or whether, if this is not for this particular type of webinar that we have, whether I can email him and ask him how I can do a bit more research. And I do hope, though physically I may not be able to make it, but I do hope to go in at the end of next year to visit and find out more.
Have you looked at Dave's website of the Z?
No, I haven't. I will do that.
Barry, I would also highly recommend that you have a look at the Kaplan Center website in Cape Town. Look up Kaplan Center.
South Africa? The Kaplan Center in South Africa. Yeah, they haven't been able to help me, but I'll...
they have records of the certainly they have a lot of records of people migrating from via the UK to South Africa. The shipping records but to answer your questions more specifically,
the only records they've been able to give me are death notices. All my family's death notices, nothing else. And I've tried them.
Well, they do have shipping records as well. I mean, I found
I do have shipping records. This is why there's some conflict. But please go ahead and tell me though. Continue. I'm sorry.
So, you asked about whether they came directly. It's a hard one. I would say that the trend was to try their luck first in South Africa, And if that didn't work out, then sort of the new territories of Rhodesia and northern Rhodesia were certainly much more. They were like, there were opportunities. People felt there were much more opportunities. Perhaps the gold rush in Johannesburg and the diamond rush in Kimberley had kind of started to peter out, and not everybody was benefiting from that economic activity. And so they probably, like, I can talk about my family, as I mentioned, who arrived in Pretoria, but they sought sort of more fertile grounds further north and they moved, to the area which is now
I'm pretty sure they went directly there. And I have a photo, and I've just posted. Oh, she's commented. Well, no, I just posted for Doreen Ellenbogen, if she would email me, because I have a late 1890s photo with Ellenbogens. So with my family.
Look,
and Ellenbogens.
I do know that there were during the 1930s. This was later. There were issues of quotas. The South Africans didn't allow Jews, and so they were forced to go further north, where it was easier to get a visa to get in. But I'm talking about later. I'm talking about the later.
They were in Cape Town by 1905. It was like a 10-year period. I think they were over there. Would it be unusual, would you think? He was still on the electoral roll in 1910, but I don't believe he was living there. I think he was living in Cape Town. Would that be unusual?
I can't really say if it's unusual or not. I'm happy to exchange. We could have an offline call on this, and we can explore different ways to explore that.
I would appreciate that. And
I would also say that anybody who's got any queries or things, write into me to info@schol.website, and we will pass the questions on to whoever needs them. And if anybody would like to be on the whole mailing list and you're not already on it, again, it's info@chol.website. Just email us and we'll fix you up. So we look forward to meeting again the same time next week, and look forward to the next session, Dave. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Geraldine.
For your pictures and your stories.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Well, look, so good night, everybody. And
thank you, Geraldine. Thanks, Dave. That was great.
Bye-bye.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.